Right now, when times are good, society relies on the rule of law for people's interactions to be civil and productive. In the case of a full-blown post-collapse environment, the burden of imposing and upholding a rule of law is a responsibility that's going to be transferred to individual groups. If a group wishes to function as a cohesive, well-oiled machine that is productive, mutually supportive, and not bound for self-destruction when times get really hard, it is going to require that everybody adheres to a commonly agreed upon set of rules. That's what we're going to talk about today. Alright, so there's a few other YouTubers who are throwing up videos about post-collapse group dynamics, and I thought I would throw in my 2 cents and maybe fill in some of the gaps of what they left unsaid. Perhaps there'll be a little bit of repetition as well, but hopefully only on the points that need emphasis. Now, before we dive into this, we need to have a clear definition of what we mean by a group. Essentially, a group is going to be a bunch of different families which are working together. A big factor which is going to determine how this plays out is the proximity with which they live to one another. So if you have a group or a community of people who live scattered in a rural environment miles apart, that's going to be a lot different than if you have a group who lives in a compound. Now, arguably, if times really get tough, you are going to have people gravitating towards a compound lifestyle only if personal security is a factor. Because when security from outside threats becomes a factor, you know, roving gangs, marauders, that type of thing, that's when there's going to be safety in numbers and people are going to want to come together as close as possible. And this is going to make a lot of strategic sense as well. Now, the rules of the game are going to be much different if people are close or if they're further apart. And another variable that's going to come into play is the relationship between these people pre-collapse. So is there a phenol ties? Or is this extended family? Because if it's extended family, the trust factor goes way up. If this is just a bunch of people who got together post-collapse and decided to make a go at it, the trust factor is going to be proportional to the degree of a phenol ties in pre-collapse relationships. That's what I would say. So the best case scenario for group survival, in my opinion, post-collapse, and we're talking like a full-blown SHTF situation, there's no functioning government, there is no rule of law. The best case scenario for that, for a group, in my personal opinion, is going to be some kind of compound of sorts that's surrounded by arable land. There's going to be some natural boundaries, there's going to be a water source. That's going to be the ideal scenario. And within that scenario, you're going to have a phenol ties mixed in with, you know, people who've lived in the same community their whole lives. So even though they don't share a bloodline, they have a deep experience. Now, obviously, that is not going to be the case in a lot of situations, because you got to think about it. How many plots of land are going to have enough buildings on them to support large groups of people like that? And it's going to be a while before things get good enough that you could actually start constructing new dwellings for people who want to come into this community or compound. This could also take shape in a gated community, but once again, people nowadays are worlds apart from their neighbors, so the trust factor is going to greatly diminish. Now, the reason for this preamble about proximity is because it's going to determine the politics that are ultimately going to govern how people interact. And in addition to that, the amount of threats are also going to determine the politics that transpire. So let me give you a little sense of what I'm talking about here. So when there's immediate threats in the environment, people are going to band together. They're going to be very egalitarian in how they share resources. Hey man, I'm running out of bullets. Can I have some bullets? Yeah, sure. Just, you know, help me shoot these guys. That's basically what it's going to come down to. Oh, you need some medication. You're sick. You need some food to help us, you know, resist this invading force. Then we're going to give that to you. But as soon as times get good and, you know, we get into peacetime, that's when people start to get a more competitive mindset. And perhaps this is also reflected in how nations develop and go through communistic and capitalistic free market phases. in that the trajectory that some countries take, they emerge from feudalism, they go into communism, and eventually the free market prevails, and in some cases, loops back around into communism and blah, blah, blah. So what you're going to have happen is, once all the marauders go away and all the threats dissipate, then you're going to have people take on a stockpiling, hoarding mentality, because no longer does their personal security rely on sharing. So the better things get, naturally people are going to be less inclined to share, in my opinion, and people are going to become more independent in how they manage the resources of the community. Now, if you have a group which is very spread out, once again, there's not going to be a collective ration. It's not going to be very communistic. When you're talking about a post-collapse compound, one of the main things that's going to transpire there is going to be a very egalitarian, communistic division of resources policy. You're probably going to end up with one warehouse, and you're going to delegate who is in charge of inventory, and you're going to divvy out rations, and everybody is going to get the same, or the same proportional to body size, sex, that type of thing, because of course you don't want a 200-pound guy who's working in the sun all day having the same amount of food ration as an elderly woman who maybe only burns 1,000 calories a day. So like I'm saying, these are all things that are going to set the initial stage for the constitution that you develop amongst the group. Because in the absence of the Constitution of the United States, and I base this on the United States because that's where the majority of my viewers are from, and realistically Canada and the United States are in total lockstep. The only reason why there's a constitution in the United States right now is because of the rule of law. Without the rule of law, tyranny would prevail. And in many cases, of course, rule of law is used as a mechanism for tyrants to emerge. But generally speaking, as I indicated in the beginning of this video, the task of imposing and upholding a rule of law is going to be offloaded to individuals and the group as a whole. So from the get-go, there needs to be a representative from every part of the community, from every family, come together and democratically create and agree upon what the laws are going to be, what the punishments are going to be from deviating from those laws within the group. And you are going to want this process to be as engaged and reciprocal as possible so that everybody has a fair say before you lay the law down. Now, obviously, there's going to be a leader which emerges at some point down the road. There's always going to be alphas. There's going to be people bumping heads. There's just going to be people who are better at making decisions, and sometimes leaders are just naturally selected by the group. People seek out people to follow. So the leader is going to emerge, holding the leader to the exact same standard as everybody else, while recognizing the fact that they are tasked with a greater set of responsibilities and thus might need more provisions in some cases so that they can do their job effectively, is going to be very important, because especially in the beginning when times are tight, everybody is going to be gunning for equality of resources. If food rations are low, everybody's going to want to know that they're going to have their fair share, that their family is going to have their fair share. So if they're contributing to a collective warehouse of goods, they're going to want to make sure that the fruits of their labor are being equally distributed. Now, there's a variety of different laws that are going to need to be imposed. I think the number one law is going to have to be around the rationing of resources. Actually, the number one law is probably going to have to be a do with security, the criteria for who is allowed to join the group, how they're integrated into the group, that sort of thing. But a very close second is going to be the rationing of resources, and selecting a person who is ideal for the position of overseeing the management of the resources is going to be very critical. You're going to want somebody who is very trustworthy and has a stake in remaining in a stable compound, which is why I think that the person that you get to do inventory within your community, if we're talking closed compound here, it should be a woman, and it should be a woman who has children, because a woman who has children has a vested interest in that community thriving so it can protector. Whereas a person who has no child rearing responsibilities or no elderly, sick family, immobilized family responsibilities, they don't have a vested interest in being that community. So at the drop of the hat, if things get bad, they could potentially screw the entire group over, and you don't want that to happen. And the information that this person holds from an operational security perspective is going to be very critical, because they have the ability to bring down the entire group if what they know gets out, because they're going to know the group's capabilities and what they're not capable of. They're going to be aware of their weaknesses. They're going to know how many bullets they have. They're going to know how many days worth of rations. So if an enemy wanted to do some sort of war by attrition or otherwise, they hold the keys to the kingdom in a lot of ways. So this must be a person that you trust. The next law has to revolve around family planning. If you know that there is no functioning government and the prognosis is very bleak and there is death and destruction all around you, you absolutely need to promote family planning. Unexpected pregnancies could seriously impact the functioning of a group, because a pregnant woman has a lot of special needs which are going to potentially require you to put your people in precarious situations in order to get certain supplies. And of course, that's just another mouth to feed. It's another human liability. Now, the time may come when the group is able to sustain and bring forth a new generation of people. But when things are getting down to the wire, and when you have all these potential challenges and everything's foobar, people are trying to steal your stuff, other groups are competing with you, the last thing you need at that point in time is another mouth to feed who doesn't really contribute much in terms of the labor they produce. That sounds kind of mean, but that's just the reality of the situation. There will be a time to play house and make babies when things cool down a bit. But while you are building up this new community, you can't have women running around who are incapacitated because of prenatal illness. The next set of laws is going to revolve around your diplomatic process. There's going to have to be a very strict vetting process to determine who you allow to integrate into your community. And I do say integrate. It's very important that they conform to your pre-existing rules, and there has to be some sort of probationary process in which they undergo before they're afforded the full rights of a citizen of your community. And I don't mean in terms of, do they get a full ration or whether or not they're respected. Of course, those things are going to have to be in place. But I'm more so talking about how much they are entrusted to know about what goes on in the group, and absolutely limiting their access to weapons. Firearms is going to be crucial until you know with 100% certainty that they are to be trusted. I would be much more inclined to trust a family of people who had children, because once again, they have a vested interest in having some sort of social stability. A person who is a lone wolf, or even a person who has maybe children who are already grown up and they don't need that community to shelter and protect them. I'm not saying that those people wouldn't be valuable, because they may have very good skill sets that your community needs. But if we're simply talking about who you can trust, I'd be much more inclined to trust someone who had a family. Now, that said, that doesn't mean, once again, that lone wolf drifters are not going to be potentially great contributors to your community if all works out. It's just a reality of the situation you have to consider. The next law is going to revolve around a thing called temperance, and it's very similar to the rationing of resources, being sexually responsible, and it's basically minding your consumption of drugs and alcohol. Especially if you have people who have propensities for addiction pre-collapse, they're going to have to get that in check right from the get-go, because the last thing you want is somebody like that running around whose behaviors are being dictated by their addiction. And you need to understand that people with extreme addiction problems, in some cases when times are good, they will steal from their own grandmothers. I'm not saying all of them, but some people are that far gone that they would do that. So when times get bad, it wouldn't be hard for them to sell out their communities, even if they don't really intend to do it. So this is why it's important, and this will lead into the next law, is that you do have an interview of sorts with everybody within the community so you get some background information on them. And this was done in the Walking Dead. I kind of stole this one from there in Alexandria. She wants to interview everybody because she wants to learn about their character. And I think that's a really great idea because you want to know the backstory of a person, and you might even want to have 1 or 2 or even 3 or even 4 people sit in on these interviews so you can get a variety of different perspectives, because sometimes people are good liars and they might be covering something up. Maybe they did time for something at one point. You want to know all that information. And if you do discover a personal history about an individual that leads you to believe that they are less trustworthy, you're going to have to determine if you want to afford them as much rights within that community as everybody else. And once again, all of this is going to be established from the get-go in the Constitution or rule of law that everybody sits down and creates, and everybody physically signs off on. I would get a representative from every family to sign on to whatever sort of collective agreement is made for the imposition of communal rule of law. Now, the next thing, of course, is going to be boundaries. And this comes by way of not only sexual conduct, but also by way of simple mutual respect for the boundaries of other people. Any transgressions of a sexual nature, sexual assaults, cannot be tolerated at any cost, because this is going to potentially lead to significant disharmony amongst the group, and people who do cross this line should be dealt with as judiciously, decisively, and swiftly as possible. So to make it very clear to everybody in that community that that sort of behavior is not going to be tolerated. Another thing which is going to be very important is an awareness of where everybody is at any given time. You can't just have, people wandering off unannounced. You need some sort of buddy system. You need some sort of check-in, check-out system, and it needs to be more than just one person. It needs to be at least 3 people, like a 3-pairing buddy system. So if person X goes out of town, 2 people are aware of it. Now, depending on the post-collapse environment conditions, that's going to determine whether or not you're having people leave the compound by themselves in the first place. Conditions might be such that you're not exiting the perimeter unless you have 4 or 5 people with you at all times. There are, of course, going to be some cases where having 1 or 2 people is going to be much better because you're going to make less noise. It's going to be, especially if you're on a reconnaissance or information gathering mission, or even a scavenging run that requires you be a little bit more discreet. Now, there's a lot of other nuance to all of this that needs to be talked about. So I'm going to leave it up to you guys in the comments section to dictate where we take this discussion as we delve further into the specifics of group dynamics post SHTF, and I'm going to integrate comments which are pertinent into a follow-up video to this one. So I hope you found that useful today. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. Canadian Prepper out. The best way to support this YouTube channel is to support yourself by gearing up through CanadianPreparedness.com or BugoutRoll.ca. Premium quality gear at the best possible price using the incredibly secure and easy to use Shopify platform. We offer free shipping to the United States for orders over $200 USD and free shipping to Canada over $75. So support the channel by supporting yourself.